Picture this. You are 7 years old. Your father looks at you, decides he does not want you and walks away. Not because you did something wrong, not because you were a bad child, but because of who your mother was and the whispers that followed her name wherever she went. You and your mother are pushed out, cast out, sent to wander with nothing into a world that has already made up its mind about you. Now here is the question I want you to sit with before we even begin. What does that do to a child? Not what does it do to a king, not what does it do to a warrior. What does it do to the 7-year-old boy who has no say in any of it, who did not choose his mother, did not choose his circumstances, did not choose to be born into a situation that made powerful men uncomfortable? Because that is where this story actually starts. Not on a battlefield, not with a spear in hand, not with thousands of warriors standing at attention waiting for his command. It starts with a little boy and his mother, walking away from everything they had, with the laughter of other children chasing them out of the village. His name was Shaka, and by the time this story ends, that name would make entire kingdoms stop breathing. But we are not starting at the end. We are starting at the beginning, the real beginning, the part most people skip over because it is painful and unglamorous and it does not fit neatly into the legend. We are starting with the boy nobody wanted, because that boy is the only reason any of the rest of it happened. To understand Shaka, you first have to understand the world he was born into. Southern Africa in the late 1700s was not a quiet place. The land between the Drakensberg Mountains and the Indian Ocean coast, the region we now call KwaZulu-Natal, was home to dozens of Nguni-speaking clans. Each clan had its own chief. Each chief had his own territory, his own cattle, his own people. Life was organized, but it was never fully peaceful. Clans raided each other for cattle. Boundaries shifted. Alliances formed and broke apart. There was a constant low hum of competition between groups, and where you were born and who your father was determined almost everything about the life you would live. Shaka was born around 1787. His father was Senzingakona, a chief of a small and relatively minor clan called the Zulu. The Zulu were not powerful at this point. They were a small group, a few hundred people at most, nobody of great consequence in the wider landscape of the region. His mother was a woman named Nandi. And Nandi is a person you need to understand because without her, Shaka does not exist, not just physically but as a person. Nandi was from a neighboring clan called the Langeni. She was described by those who knew her as strong-willed, direct, and not the kind of woman who made herself small to make men comfortable. In a world where women were expected to be quiet and compliant, Nandi had a presence that people noticed. She and Senzingakona had a relationship that was complicated from the start. The details vary depending on who is telling the story, but what is consistent across accounts is this. Nandi became pregnant, and Senzingakona was not eager to claim the child or the mother. When Nandi sent word that she was pregnant, one version of the story says that Senzingakona's people sent back a dismissive message, suggesting that what she thought was a pregnancy was just an intestinal beetle called Ishaka. It was meant to be an insult, a way of saying, "This is not our problem." The child was born anyway. And whether out of irony or defiance, the name Shaka stuck. For a short time, Senzingakona did take Nandi and the boy in. He had other wives, and Nandi was never fully accepted. She was an outsider. Her son was treated as less than. The other wives made sure Shaka and Nandi felt their lower status every single day. Then, when Shaka was around 6 or 7 years old, it ended. Senzingakona sent them away. Just like that. Mother and son back to the Langeni clan, back to Nandi's people. If you think that was a relief, that coming home meant safety, you would be wrong. The Langeni did not exactly welcome them either. Nandi had left under complicated circumstances. She came back with a child whose father did not want him. In a society built on lineage and clan loyalty that carried a kind of social weight that is hard to fully explain, it was not just embarrassing. It was a mark, a label. Shaka grew up among the Langini, being reminded constantly that he did not fully belong. Other children mocked him. They mocked his mother. There is an account widely told of Shaka being responsible for watching over a group of sheep, and one of the sheep was killed by a dog. It sounds like a small thing, but in a community where cattle and livestock were wealth, where a child's usefulness was measured in practical terms, being blamed for that loss was humiliating. The response from the community was harsh. Nandi and Shaka were driven out again. So now they are wandering a second time. Think about what that is like. Think about being a child who has already been rejected by his father, who has already been treated as unwanted and now is being pushed out again. No stability, no home that actually feels like home. The message being sent to this boy over and over is the same message. You do not belong here. You are not enough. Nobody wants you. Most people under that kind of weight collapse inward. They become small. They learn to disappear. Shaka did not collapse. But it is important to say this clearly. That is not because he was some mythical figure who felt nothing. It is because his mother refused to let him. Nandi was everything during those years. She is often written out of Shaka's story or reduced to a footnote. She was not a footnote. She was the reason he survived long enough to become anything at all. She never let him believe the story the world was trying to tell him about himself. She kept moving. She kept finding a way. She eventually brought them to the Mthethwa clan under a powerful chief named Dingiswayo. And that is where everything began to change. Shaka arrived at the Mthethwa as a teenager with no status, no wealth, no connections, and no reputation. In a society where all of those things mattered enormously, he was starting from below zero. What he had was his body, his mind, and a hunger that years of rejection had sharpened into something almost frightening. He joined the Mthethwa military system. Nguni clans at this time organized young men into age-based regiments called Amabatho. You trained together, you lived together, you fought together. It was a system designed to build loyalty, discipline, and fighting capability. Shaka was exceptional almost immediately, but not in the ways you might expect. Yes, he was physically imposing. Accounts describe him as tall, broad-shouldered, powerfully built. He could move fast and hit hard. Those things helped. But what made him different was that he watched, he studied. He asked questions other soldiers were not asking. Questions like, why do we fight this way and not another way? Why is this weapon better than that one in this situation? What are we not seeing? The standard weapon of Nguni warriors at the time was a long throwing spear called an assegai. The idea was to throw it at the enemy from a distance and then engage in combat. Shaka thought this was wasteful. When you throw your spear, you lose it. You are now unarmed. The fight has not even started properly and you have already given up your primary weapon. He began working with a different concept. A shorter, heavier spear with a broader blade, designed not for throwing but for close-quarters combat. He combined this with a larger shield, used not just to block but to hook the enemy's shield aside and expose their body. This sounds like a small tactical adjustment. It was not. It was a completely different philosophy of fighting. The old way kept the enemy at a distance. Shaka's way demanded that you close the gap, that you get close enough to look the enemy in the face, that you commit completely to the fight rather than launching a projectile and hopping for the best. It required a different kind of soldier, one with more nerve, more physical conditioning, more willingness to go forward when every instinct said to stay back. Shaka trained himself to be that soldier, and then he set about building others into that soldier. Dingiswayo recognized what he had in this young man. He gave Shaka command. He let him experiment. He let him lead. And Shaka delivered. By the time he was in his late 20s, Shaka was one of the most effective military commanders in the region. Not the most famous. Not yet. But those who had seen him in action understood that something unusual was happening. Then in 1816, his father Senzangakona died. The man who had walked away from him, the man who had sent him and his mother out into uncertainty with nothing, dead. And suddenly, the question of who would lead the Zulu clan was open. Shaka had a half-brother named Sigujana who took the Zulu chieftaincy after their father's death. Sigujana had grown up with status and legitimacy. He had grown up inside the clan, recognized, wanted. Shaka had Dingiswayo's backing, and he had years of rage that had been quietly, carefully converted into purpose. He moved on the Zulu clan. Sigujana was killed, and in 1816, Shaka, the boy who had been thrown out, became chief of the Zulu. He was probably around 29 years old. Now here is where you might expect the story to become simple. The underdog wins. The outcast takes power. Triumphant music, celebration, end of the hard part. That is not what happened. What happened is that Shaka looked at the Zulu clan, the group his father had led, the group that had treated his mother as less than, the group he was now supposed to lead, and he saw something small. Something that did not match what was inside his head. The Zulu at this point were maybe 1,500 people. What Shaka had in his mind was something that had never existed in this region before. Shaka began immediately. There was no settling in period, no gradual adjustment. He moved fast and he moved with total clarity about what he wanted. The military reforms came first. He expanded the Amabutho system. He took the short spear and large shield combination he had developed and drilled it into every fighter under his command until it was reflex, not thought. He organized his men into a formation that would become his signature, the chest and horns. The chest was the main body of warriors who engaged the enemy directly at the center. The horns were two wings that wrapped around the sides of the enemy formation simultaneously. The idea was to encircle, to cut off retreat, to make the fight a closed room with no exit. Supporting the chest and horns was a reserve. A fourth group held back, sitting with their backs to the fight so they would not get excited and charge before they were needed. This was not random. Every piece of it had been thought through carefully. The reserve, the encirclement, the close quarters weapons. It formed a system. And systems, when built well and drilled relentlessly, produce results that individual acts of bravery cannot match. But Shaka understood something else, something that many leaders miss entirely. A military formation is only as good as the men in it, and men fight differently when they have a reason that goes beyond being told to. He built identity, he built belonging. He understood from his own childhood what it felt like to have no place, no group that claimed you. He understood the hunger that comes from that, and he used that understanding to build something in his warriors that went beyond discipline. He made them feel that they were part of something, that the regiment was their family in a way their actual families might not have been, that the Zulu identity was worth fighting for because it was theirs. The warriors who trained under Shaka were not allowed to marry until he gave permission, which typically came after years of service. This sounds restrictive, and it was, but the effect was that young men were fully invested in the regiment. That was their world. That was where they belonged. And when the thing you belong to is under threat, you do not need someone to tell you to fight. You already know. Here is where the story gets harder. Shaka's expansion was not gentle. It could not be. The region was competitive and had been for generations. Diplomacy had its place, but Shaka was not building a coalition. He was building an empire. Clans that submitted were absorbed. Their young men joined the Amabutho. Their chiefs were replaced or subordinated. The people remained, but the power shifted. Clans that resisted were dealt with in ways that left a message for the clans watching. This created something historians call the Mfecking, though the details and even the name are still debated by scholars. It refers to a period of massive disruption across southern Africa as the Zulu expansion sent ripple effects outward. Clans displaced other clans. Groups that fled Zulu expansion ran into other groups. The movement of people, the breaking of old structures, the forming of new ones, all of it traces back in some degree to what Shaka was building. There were real human costs to this. Displacement, death, communities broken apart. That is not a small thing, and it should not be treated as one. At the same time, something genuinely remarkable was being built. The Zulu nation under Shaka grew from roughly 1,500 people in 1816 to somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 people within a decade. The military went from a small clan force to an army of around 40,000 trained warriors. He was not just winning battles, he was creating a state. And he was doing it through a combination of military genius, psychological understanding, and an absolute refusal to accept the limitations that the world had tried to assign to him as a child. In 1827, Nandi died. Nandi, his mother, the woman who had walked beside him through every rejection, who had refused to let him believe the story the world was telling about him, who had kept moving when staying still would have been easier. She died, and something in Shaka broke open. The mourning he commanded was extreme by almost any measure. Accounts from the period describe a period of intense national mourning that went beyond what was customary. Some of what followed has been described as erratic, even harsh. Historians debate the details, but what most agree on is this. The death of Nandi exposed something in Shaka that his military discipline and his strategic mind had kept covered for years. He had never fully stopped being that boy. The one who had been cast out, the one who had watched his mother be humiliated, the one who had carried the weight of her survival alongside his own for his entire life. Nandi's death did not just take a person. It took the only witness to who he had been before any of it. The only person who had known him when he was nothing and had loved him anyway. That kind of loss does not have a clean name. After Nandi's death, Shaka's rule became harder, less stable. The commanders around him, the people closest to him, began to see a man who was changing in ways that made the future uncertain. In September 1828, less than 2 years after Nandi's death, Shaka was assassinated. It was not a battle. It was not a rival clan that finally found a way to defeat him in the field. It was his own half-brothers, Dingane and Mhlengana, people from inside, people who had watched him build everything and decided that the man at the center of it had become too unpredictable to follow. He was killed at the royal residence at Dukuza. He was approximately 41 years old. The boy who had been told he did not matter, who had been cast out twice before he was 10 years old, who had arrived at the Mthethwa as a teenager with nothing, had built one of the most powerful military states in the history of southern Africa. And then he was gone. So what do we do with this story? Because it is not a clean story. It is not the kind of story that ties up neatly at the end with a lesson that fits on a motivational poster. Shaka built something extraordinary. He also caused real suffering in the process. Both of those things are true. They live in the same story, in the same life, and you cannot separate them without lying about who he was. But here is what stays with me. He was cast out at 7 years old. At 7, most of us are worried about things that, looking back, seem so small. What is for dinner? Whether our friends want to play. Shaka was learning at 7 that the world could decide you do not count and then act accordingly. He carried that. He carried it through the wandering years with his mother, through the mockery of the Langeni children, through the second expulsion, through arriving at the Mthethwa with nothing but his body and his mind and a hunger that had nowhere else to go. And here is the thing about that hunger. It can destroy you. It can turn inward and eat you alive. We have all seen what happens to people who carry that kind of early wound without anything to direct it toward. The rage becomes the whole story. What Shaka did, and this is genuinely rare, was convert it. He took the energy of rejection and turned it into study, into discipline, into an obsessive commitment to understanding how things worked and how they could work better, into a refusal to accept the ceiling that had been placed over his head. He did not transcend his wound, he used it. There is a difference. Transcending a wound means getting past it, leaving it behind, becoming someone for whom it no longer matters. Shaka never got past it. The way he reacted to Nandi's death makes that clear. The wound was always there. But using a wound is different. Using it means taking the energy it generates, the alertness, the refusal, the hunger, and pointing it at something, building something, proving something not to the people who rejected you, but to yourself. That is a much harder thing to do than it sounds. And what it produced, in Shaka's case, was a military and organizational mind that was genuinely ahead of its time. The tactics he developed were not the obvious next step from what came before. They required him to question assumptions that everyone around him had accepted without examination. They required him to be willing to look strange, to do things differently, to face the discomfort of being the person in the room with a different idea. That comfort with being different, with being the one who does not fit, was not a gift. It was something he had learned, the hard way, over years of being told he did not fit. The rejection that was meant to diminish him became the thing that made him uncontainable. Now think about your own life for a moment. Because I am not telling you this story just to give you interesting historical information about 19th century Southern Africa. I am telling you this because most of us have a version of this. Most of us have something we were told about ourselves early on that was not kind. A parent who made us feel like we were not enough. A community that treated us as an outsider. A failure that came with a label attached. A moment when the message from the world was, you do not belong here. What did you do with that? What are you doing with it now? Because the story of Shaka is not really about a Zulu king. It is about what a human being does when the world tries to write a small story about them. Some people accept the small story. They spend their lives fitting inside the box that rejection built around them. Some people fight the story. They spend their energy proving the people wrong, which is its own kind of trap, because you are still letting them set the agenda. And then there are the rare ones. The ones who look at the small story the world tried to write about them and decide, almost quietly, to write a completely different one. Not for anyone else, not to prove anything to the people who cast them out, just because they know, somewhere deep and unkillable, that the story the world told was wrong. Shaka knew. He knew it as a boy walking away from his father's village. He knew it as a teenager arriving at the Mthethwa with nothing. He knew it every time someone underestimated what he was building. And he let that knowing be the engine of everything. His mother kept that knowing alive in him during the years when it would have been easy to give up on it. Nandi is the quiet hero of this story, the one who refused to let the world's verdict become her son's self-image. She could not give him status or wealth or protection. She could give him belief, and she did, every day of those wandering, uncertain years. When she died, he lost the one person who had always reflected that belief back to him. And without that mirror, something in him struggled. That too is a human truth. We are not fully self-contained. We need people who see us, who knew us before the titles and the victories, who remember the version of us that had not proven anything yet and believed in that version anyway. Losing that person is not something you get over. You learn to carry it differently, but you do not get over it. Shaka carried it badly in the end. That is honest. The last period of his reign shows a man whose wound had finally gotten larger than his ability to convert it. But the 20-odd years before that show something else entirely. They show what is possible when a human being refuses to let their origin become their destiny. Shaka was cast out at 7 years old. He died at 41, having built something that no one before him had managed to build in that part of the world. Between those two facts is a life that most people will never fully understand, because most people want to start the story at the moment of triumph and skip the years of wandering and mockery and uncertainty that came before. But the wandering years are the story. The rejection is the story. The boy walking away from his father's village with his mother's hand in his, with nothing else, that is the whole story. Because without that, none of the rest of it happens. Not the tactics, not the army, not the nation, not the name that eventually made powerful men in other parts of the continent take notice and start asking questions about who exactly was building what down in the south. The world tried to write a small story about Shaka Senzingakona. He wrote a different one. And I think that matters, not just as history, but as something you can sit with today. Whatever the small story is that someone tried to write about you, whatever the rejection was that you carry, whatever the version of being cast out you have lived through, that is not the whole story. Unless you let it be. I want to hear from you. What part of Shaka's journey hit closest for you? And if you are comfortable sharing, have you ever had a moment where something that was meant to diminish you ended up being the thing that pushed you forward? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one and I respond. If this story meant something to you, please hit like and subscribe. We release new stories about real people facing impossible moments every single week. And as always, thank you for being here. This has been Archivist Owl.